In one of the most gruesome executions in ancient history, Marcus Atilius Regulus, a Roman general, met his end in a cauldron of boiling oil. His name has long been tied to honor, sacrifice, and unimaginable suffering, a tale that continues to echo across centuries. But to understand why his death stands out as one of antiquity's darkest episodes, we must first recognize the man behind the legend. Regulus was not a nameless victim of war, but one of Rome's most respected leaders, a commander who had once stood at the height of power and victory. His fall from triumph to torment reveals the brutal logic of ancient warfare, where glory and cruelty often walked hand in hand. Regulus was born into a world where Rome was rising, hungry for dominance, and locked in deadly competition with Carthage. The 3rd century BC was a time of relentless expansion, and Rome, fresh from victories on the Italian peninsula, turned its gaze outward to the Mediterranean. Carthage, wealthy and formidable, controlled trade routes that Rome craved, and the collision between these two powers was inevitable. The First Punic War would erupt as a struggle for survival, a test of endurance that consumed men, resources, and entire cities. It was within this crucible that Regulus would rise to fame, and ultimately meet a fate so terrifying it seared itself into history. At first, his career was a story of brilliance and promise. Regulus climbed Rome's political ladder, won the consulship, and commanded armies with skill that brought him admiration from soldiers and senators alike. His courage on the battlefield and his uncompromising loyalty to Rome set him apart as the embodiment of Roman virtue. He became a symbol of what the Republic demanded of its leaders: unyielding discipline, iron resolve, and a willingness to place duty above life itself. These very qualities, however, would lead him down a path from which there would be no escape. The war between Rome and Carthage was unlike any conflict the Mediterranean had seen before. Rome, a land-based power, was forced to build a navy from nothing, challenging Carthaginian mastery of the seas. Battles raged on land and water, and both sides endured devastating losses. Yet amid the chaos, Regulus emerged as one of Rome's brightest stars. In 256 BC, entrusted with the bold task of carrying war directly into North Africa, he led one of the largest Roman armadas ever assembled across the Mediterranean. With hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of men, he struck fear into the Carthaginian heartland. His victories on African soil nearly brought Carthage to its knees, and for a moment, it seemed the war might end with Rome triumphant. But the tides of fortune in war are fickle. The very victories that lifted Regulus to legendary status also sowed the seeds of his destruction. Overconfidence, harsh demands for Carthaginian surrender, and the sudden appearance of new leadership on the enemy side turned triumph into disaster. Regulus would see his army destroyed, his freedom stripped away, and his body delivered into the hands of enemies eager for vengeance. His name, once celebrated in Rome's streets, would be carried in chains through Carthage. What followed was no ordinary captivity. Regulus became the focus of political games and personal hatred, his life a bargaining chip in a war that refused to end. When he was sent back to Rome under oath, given a fleeting chance at freedom, he shocked both allies and enemies alike by choosing duty over survival. And when he returned to Carthage, bound by his word, he was met not with mercy but with cruelty so calculated it staggered even the brutal standards of the ancient world. His final hours, in which his body was lowered inch by inch into boiling oil before a horrified crowd, transformed him into both a martyr and a symbol. To the Romans, he embodied unbreakable honor. To the Carthaginians, he became a demonstration of vengeance carried to its most terrifying extreme. The story of Marcus Atilius Regulus does not survive simply because he was killed, but because of the manner of his death and the values that brought him to it. His execution was not just punishment, it was a message to nations, an act of political theater, and a warning about the costs of defiance. More than 2,000 years later, his name still forces us to ask a question that shakes the foundations of morality and leadership: is there any principle worth dying for in such a way? His answer, delivered through fire and oil, still resounds. Marcus Atilius Regulus was born around 307 BC into the Roman aristocracy, a world where lineage, discipline, and the service of the state defined a man's worth. From the earliest years of his life, He was shaped by the values that the Republic held sacred: courage in the face of danger, unwavering discipline in both private and public life, and an uncompromising devotion to Rome above all else. For men like Regulus, duty was not an abstract concept but a living force, one that demanded sacrifice without hesitation. It was this foundation of iron principles that would one day carry him to Rome's highest offices, and ultimately lead him to one of the most nightmarish deaths ever recorded. The Republic into which Regulus was born was not yet the sprawling empire it would become. Rome was still carving out its dominance over the Italian peninsula, battling tribes, rival cities, and established powers for control. The air was thick with ambition. Victories in war did not merely expand borders, they elevated families, cemented reputations, and inscribed names into the annals of history. Regulus, raised within this crucible, quickly absorbed the belief that personal survival was insignificant compared to the glory of Rome. He would live, and die, by that creed. By 267 BC, Regulus had risen to the consulship, the highest elected office of the Republic, entrusted with supreme command of armies and the weight of Roman destiny. In his early campaigns in southern Italy, he displayed the sharp mind and ruthless determination that would define his career. He crushed the Salentini, a people resisting Roman expansion, securing not only new territory but also the admiration of the Senate and the loyalty of his soldiers. He was no mere aristocrat resting on his family's status. Regulus proved himself on the battlefield, where the measure of a man was written in blood and victory. His reputation grew quickly. Soldiers spoke of his unflinching resolve, his willingness to share in the hardships of the camp, and his fierce enforcement of discipline. To follow Regulus into battle was to march with a commander who embodied the Roman virtues every man aspired to. To the Senate, he was a rising star, a leader capable of carrying Rome's ambitions beyond the shores of Italy. And at that moment in history, Rome's ambitions had never been greater. The great rival waiting across the sea was Carthage, a maritime empire whose wealth and power rested on its fleets and its control of trade routes. Carthage's harbors bustled with merchants, ivory, gold, and spices pouring in from across the known world. Its navy ruled the Mediterranean with a confidence Rome had yet to challenge. But Rome, having mastered the land, now hungered for the sea. This was not merely a competition of armies, it was a collision of civilizations. Carthage represented commerce, strategy, and pragmatism, while Rome championed iron will, discipline, and a belief that divine favor rested with the strongest. The stage was set for conflict, and men like Regulus would carry the weight of that struggle on their shoulders. The First Punic War erupted in 264 BC, igniting a fire that would burn for over 2 decades. Rome, untested at sea, built a navy from nothing and hurled itself into the waves against Carthage's seasoned fleets. The struggle consumed treasure, ships, and lives at a scale the Mediterranean had never seen. For every victory, there was a crushing defeat, and for every conquest, a desperate counterattack. It was a war of exhaustion, where men like Regulus were called to prove that Roman endurance could outlast Carthaginian cunning. Regulus' name, already spoken with admiration, soon carried the weight of expectation. The Republic needed leaders who could embody more than tactics, they needed symbols of resilience, men whose very existence would remind Romans of what they were fighting for. Regulus was becoming that symbol. His rise from consul to celebrated general was not merely the story of a man but of a nation poised on the brink of transformation, clawing its way toward supremacy. And yet, within that rise, the seeds of tragedy were already sown. For the very virtues that made Regulus a hero, unyielding discipline, uncompromising honor, and total devotion to Rome, were the same traits that would make him incapable of compromise, incapable of retreat, and ultimately incapable of saving himself when fortune turned against him. His destiny was no longer his own. It belonged to Rome, and Rome demanded everything. If you value stories of honor and sacrifice that most people have forgotten, hit subscribe now, because ignoring tales like this means letting history's greatest lessons fade away. In 256 BC, Marcus Atilius Regulus was chosen as consul for the second time, a mark of trust and power that few Romans ever achieved twice in a lifetime. The Senate, desperate to break the grinding stalemate of the First Punic War, entrusted him with an audacious mission: take the fight across the sea, strike Carthage directly in Africa, and force their submission at its very heart. No longer would Rome battle endlessly in Sicily over fortified towns and narrow fields. This campaign was designed to terrify the Carthaginians by bringing Roman legions to their homeland, something they had never before experienced. The scale of the undertaking was monumental. Rome assembled one of the largest fleets it had ever launched, over 300 ships carrying nearly 140,000 men. To the Carthaginians, long accustomed to commanding the seas, the sight of this armada moving across the Mediterranean was more than a military threat. It was a message: Rome would not be contained by the limits of its land power. It was willing to invade foreign soil, willing to risk everything, and willing to challenge Carthage where it was strongest. When Regulus landed his forces on the African coast near Cruelty, the effect was immediate and devastating. Roman discipline, combined with the shock of their sudden arrival, overwhelmed Carthaginian resistance. Cities fell quickly, fields burned, and the once proud Carthaginian countryside became the stage of Roman triumph. Ancient sources describe carts of treasure and caravans of ivory, gold, and exotic goods seized by Regulus troops, enriching the Roman camps and sending a clear signal back to Rome that victory was within reach. Soldiers who had endured years of exhausting warfare in Sicily now felt as if fortune itself had crossed the sea with them. But the psychological impact on Carthage was far more profound. For generations, Carthage had been the aggressor, projecting its fleets and armies outward across the Mediterranean. Now, for the first time, Carthaginian mothers could hear Roman war horns echoing across their own fields. Panic seized the city. The ruling council, faced with the possibility of a siege and destruction, began to contemplate surrender. Carthage, wealthy, powerful, and feared, suddenly felt vulnerable. Envoys were sent to Regulus in a desperate attempt to secure terms. The council hoped to preserve their city, their empire, and their future, even if it meant concessions. This moment marked the peak of Regulus' power. Rome had struck at the very heart of Carthaginian confidence, and their leaders were prepared to yield. But here, at the threshold of complete triumph, Regulus made choices that revealed both the strength and the fatal rigidity of his Roman character. The terms he demanded were not simply harsh, they were annihilating. He insisted that Carthage surrender Sicily and Sardinia, pay massive reparations that would cripple their economy, and reduce their once mighty fleet to a token force, stripping them of their naval dominance. In effect, he demanded that Carthage cease to exist as a true power and submit itself as a vassal to Rome. For Carthage, these were not terms of peace but of humiliation and slow death. In Roman eyes, such demands were the natural reward of victory. In Carthaginian eyes, they were intolerable. Regulus' refusal to temper his conditions, his inability to see diplomacy as anything other than total domination, turned a possible surrender into renewed resistance. At the moment when Carthage was ready to bow, his unbending sense of duty transformed them from defeated adversaries into desperate survivors prepared to fight with every weapon left at their disposal. This fatal miscalculation would soon seal his destiny. His army, far from home, dependent on stretched supply lines, was more vulnerable than he realized. And Carthage, wounded but not destroyed, would soon find in a foreign mercenary the leader they needed to turn disaster into vengeance. Most people will scroll past this, but if you're still watching, it means you care about real history. Don't just watch, join Tale of History by subscribing now. Carthage, humiliated by defeat and nearly broken by Regulus' march across their homeland, stood at the edge of ruin. The city's leaders knew that if they did not act decisively, their empire would collapse under Rome's relentless advance. Desperation forced them to look outward, beyond their own commanders, to a man whose reputation came from the hardest school of war the ancient world had ever produced, Sparta. His name was Xanthippus. Xanthippus was no ordinary mercenary. Trained in the Spartan tradition, he embodied the discipline and tactical brilliance of a people who had long defined themselves by war. When he arrived in Carthage, he found a broken army and a terrified ruling class. The Carthaginians had soldiers, cavalry, and the most terrifying weapon in their arsenal, war elephants, but they lacked a commander who could shape them into a coherent force. Xanthippus quickly took control. He reorganized their infantry, restored discipline among their troops, and gave new confidence to men who had known nothing but defeat. Most importantly, he understood the nature of Roman warfare. He recognized the strength of the legions, their iron discipline, their relentless cohesion, their refusal to break even under pressure. But he also saw their weaknesses. Roman soldiers were superb on foot, but vulnerable against the mobility of cavalry. They had never truly mastered how to counter war elephants, those towering beasts that could shatter formations with a single charge. Where the Carthaginians had failed through disorganization and fear, Xanthippus prepared to succeed with precision and ruthless calculation. In 255 BC, the two armies met near Tunis in what would become one of the most decisive clashes of the First Punic War. Regulus, confident from his earlier victories, believed his disciplined legions could withstand anything the Carthaginians put before them. He was wrong. Xanthippus arranged his forces with terrifying effectiveness. The war elephants formed a massive wall at the front, behind them stood disciplined infantry, and on the wings, swift cavalry prepared to encircle the Romans. When the battle began, the elephants charged. The ground shook as the beasts stormed forward, their tusks sheathed in iron, their sheer bulk tearing into Roman lines. Soldiers who had once marched with unshakable confidence now faced monsters they could barely comprehend. Spears snapped, shields splintered, men were crushed beneath hooves. The disciplined Roman line dissolved into chaos. As panic spread, Xanthippus unleashed his cavalry. Swift and merciless, they swept around the Roman flanks, cutting off escape and driving Regulus' men into the slaughter. The legions, trapped and disoriented, were annihilated. What had begun as a confident Roman thrust into Africa ended in disaster so complete it seemed the gods themselves had turned against them. Tens of thousands were killed or captured. The once victorious Roman force was destroyed in a single day. Yet in the midst of this catastrophe, Regulus himself stood firm. Even as his army disintegrated, he fought with the courage expected of a Roman commander, refusing to flee when all was lost. His defiance in the face of certain death preserved his honor but sealed his fate. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Marcus Atilius Regulus was taken prisoner. For Carthage, his capture was more than a military victory. It was the fall of a man who had humiliated their city, a commander whose very name had carried terror through their streets. Now he stood in chains, a symbol of their survival and a living trophy of their vengeance. For Regulus, it was the beginning of a path that would lead him away from glory and into the shadows of torment, where his loyalty to Rome would be tested in ways no battlefield could ever measure. Think about this, Regulus knew he was marching toward death, yet he stood his ground. If his courage moves you, prove it by subscribing to Tale of History. And if you won't, at least comment why. Regulus' capture was a triumph for Carthage, but his reputation ensured he could not be treated like an ordinary prisoner. At first, the Carthaginians handled him with a measure of respect. He was a Roman consul, a man of stature, and they recognized the potential value of keeping him alive. His presence was both a bargaining chip and a weapon. If used correctly, Regulus could be the key to forcing Rome into negotiations. For a time, he was lodged as an honored captive. He was not paraded through the streets as a spectacle, nor slaughtered as a warning. Instead, Carthaginian leaders debated how to use him. The war had drained their coffers, their fields had been ravaged, and their pride had been scarred. The council believed Regulus might be the voice Rome needed to hear, a living testimony to the futility of further bloodshed. If they sent him back under oath, bound by sacred promise, he could persuade the Senate to accept peace terms and end the grinding conflict once and for all. Thus, Regulus was summoned and presented with their plan. He would return to Rome, under oath before the gods, to deliver Carthage's offer. If the Senate rejected it, he was to return willingly to captivity in Africa, surrendering his life to his captors. It was a cruel bargain disguised as honor. To Carthage, it seemed impossible that anyone would willingly choose death over freedom. Surely Regulus, weary and broken by defeat, would seize this chance at life. But Regulus was Roman, and for him, an oath was not negotiable. To swear before the gods was to chain oneself to duty more binding than iron shackles. He accepted their condition, knowing what it meant. To step once more into Rome would be to embrace his home for the last time, to walk its streets knowing that each familiar sight was already part of his farewell. When he arrived in Rome, frail and worn from captivity, the people gathered to see him. They expected him to beg for mercy, to plead for peace, to urge surrender so that he might live. Instead, he stood before the Senate and did the unthinkable. He spoke against Carthage. He warned them not to trust in the enemy's offers, not to give in to fear, not to end the war when Rome stood on the edge of ultimate victory. His voice, though aged by suffering, carried the weight of conviction. He urged them to fight on, to reject the false peace of Carthage, and to continue the struggle no matter the cost. The Senate listened in stunned silence. They knew what his words meant. By rejecting the terms, Regulus condemned himself. He could have chosen survival, but he would not. He could have clung to life, but for him, life purchased at the price of dishonor was worse than death. His decision struck deep into the Roman psyche, reinforcing their belief that Rome's destiny was not to bend or compromise, but to conquer. When his task was finished, he refused to stay. Friends, family, and fellow senators begged him to remain in Rome, to break the oath and preserve his life. But Regulus shook his head. To violate his promise would be to stain his honor forever, to betray the very principles on which the Republic stood. He turned away from his home, from his wife, from his children, and from the city he had defended. Without chains, without guards, he walked back into captivity. For Regulus, death was no longer the enemy. Dishonor was. He chose to keep his word, even knowing it would lead him to agony. His return to Carthage was not the step of a broken man, but of one who had already conquered himself. In a world where survival was everything, Regulus offered his life as proof that there were values worth more than breath itself. Imagine dying to keep your word. Would you? If Regulus' story makes you question your own values, subscribe now to Tale of History. If you won't, tell us in the comments why you'd ignore courage like his. Regulus returned to Carthage as he had promised, walking into the city not as a captive dragged in chains but as a man bound by nothing but his own word. His resolve stunned the Carthaginians. To them, oaths were tools of convenience, often broken when circumstances changed. Yet here stood a Roman general who had tasted freedom, who had embraced the embrace of his homeland, yet chose to walk willingly back into the hands of his enemies. For a brief moment, there was respect. But respect soon gave way to bitterness, and bitterness hardened into cruelty. The Carthaginians could not ignore what Regulus had done in Rome. Instead of urging peace, he had convinced the Senate to fight on, prolonging the war that had already drained their wealth and blood. His return was not the triumph they had intended, but a humiliation. To them, he had mocked their generosity and turned their plan against them. And so, the council resolved that his punishment must not simply be death. It had to be a spectacle, a message carved into the flesh of Regulus and displayed before the eyes of the city. His torment began quietly, not with the sword but with the slow erosion of body and spirit. He was confined, deprived of sleep, his body kept awake with constant prodding, noise, and torment. According to the darker traditions, his eyelids were cut away, forcing his eyes to remain open under the relentless glare of the sun by day and the smoke of lamps by night. Every hour became an agony of exhaustion, his body begging for rest that would never come. But the cruelty deepened. He was confined in a spiked box, too narrow to sit, too shallow to lie down. Iron spikes jutted from the walls so that even the slightest movement drove pain into his flesh. The box was a prison designed not to hold a man but to consume him, to strip away his dignity inch by inch until all that remained was torment. Regulus endured it in silence, his body breaking but his oath unshaken. At last, when the torment had been stretched long enough, the Carthaginians prepared the final act. A cauldron of boiling oil was set before the people, an execution designed not only to kill but to humiliate, to cleanse Carthage's wounded pride with fire. Regulus was dragged out before the crowd, his body weakened but his spirit unbowed. The people gathered, expecting to see him broken, begging, pleading for mercy. Instead, he stood with the same composure he had shown in the Senate of Rome. When the moment came, he was lowered slowly into the seething cauldron. The oil hissed and spat as flesh met liquid fire, the scent of burning flesh rising with the smoke. The crowd, who had come seeking satisfaction, was struck not with triumph but with horror. Some turned away, unable to watch. Others fell silent, the weight of the moment crushing the desire for spectacle. What was meant as humiliation became instead a haunting testament to his endurance. Regulus did not die as a prisoner to be pitied, but as a man who chose honor over life, and whose final agony branded itself upon the memory of both friend and foe. For the Romans, the story of his death spread like wildfire. His torment, his suffering, and his unbroken oath became a weapon more powerful than any legion. Regulus was transformed into a martyr, his death fueling Rome's thirst for vengeance. Carthage had sought to break him, but instead, they gave him immortality. His agony became Rome's rallying cry, and his name was etched forever as a symbol of the Republic's unyielding spirit. If you've stayed this far, you clearly value truth and sacrifice. Subscribe to Tale of History. Don't be the one who hears a story like this and just walks away. The news of Regulus' death did not remain in Carthage. It crossed the sea with traders, envoys, and whispers carried by sailors until it reached Rome. When the Senate and people of the Republic learned how their consul had been tortured and boiled alive, outrage swept through the city. Rome was no stranger to brutality, its wars had long been marked by slaughter and enslavement, but the manner of Regulus' death was something different. It was not the clean end of battle. It was torment designed to break the man and, through him, the spirit of Rome. Instead, it had the opposite effect. In the Roman imagination, Regulus was instantly transformed from a defeated general into a martyr. His agony was not seen as failure, but as the ultimate expression of Roman virtue. He had chosen to return to captivity rather than break his oath. He had urged the Senate to continue the war, knowing it would cost him his life. And he had endured unspeakable pain without betraying his word. For the Republic, this was not a tragedy, it was a sacred example. That sense of vengeance did not remain abstract. Ancient accounts speak of Regulus' widow, Marcia, demanding retribution against Carthaginian prisoners held in Rome. The stories tell that she and the families of other senators subjected them to tortures mirroring what Regulus had endured, a cruel symmetry meant to restore balance and honor. Whether every detail of these tales is true or not, they reveal how deeply his suffering had seared itself into Rome's conscience. To avenge Regulus was not just personal, it was national duty. Generals carried his story into their campaigns. Orators retold his sacrifice to inspire the Senate. Poets, centuries later, would still summon his name as an emblem of courage greater than death. Regulus ceased to be a man of flesh and blood, he became an archetype, the embodiment of Rome's belief that duty outweighed survival, that honor was heavier than life itself. His example stood as a mirror to every generation that followed, asking whether they too would choose principle over comfort, fidelity over safety. Even beyond the walls of Rome, his name survived. In philosophy, his story became a lesson in ethics, a measure of what it meant to live with integrity even when surrounded by cruelty. In leadership, his decision to keep his oath was used as a parable of responsibility and sacrifice. For centuries, his death was not simply remembered, it was studied. Each retelling carried with it the same haunting truth: cruelty may shatter the body, but it cannot conquer conviction. This was the true legacy of Marcus Atilius Regulus. Carthage believed they had broken him. Instead, they immortalized him. His body burned in boiling oil, but his spirit was forged into something indestructible. Rome carried his name like a weapon, wielding it as justification for vengeance, as inspiration for endurance, and as a warning to all who doubted the Republic's resolve. The lesson remains as sharp now as it was then. Power can destroy flesh, but it cannot erase honor. Fear can silence voices, but it cannot extinguish truth. And in the end, cruelty consumes itself, leaving only the enduring flame of those who stood unbroken. Marcus Atilius Regulus was boiled alive in oil, but his honor still burns brighter than the fire that killed him. His life and death remind us that there are moments in history when the strength of a man's word becomes greater than any weapon, when conviction outlives flesh, and when sacrifice etches itself into eternity. In the end, Regulus showed the world that while cruelty can destroy the body, it cannot conquer the spirit. Don't let his story die again. Subscribe to Tale of History now, where forgotten sacrifices live on, and tell us in the comments why stories like this matter.